Thank you all for joining us tonight. I think most of you all know our guest speaker. Most of you, James has been an HSO member for 8 years and a director of HSO for 6 years and is currently our communications director. What I didn't know about James, and I was surprised to find out, was that he was born in Bermuda, and for about 30 years he worked for the Bank of Canada, which might explain why someone would leave the warmth of Bermuda to come to, of all places, Ottawa. In the time he was with the bank, he co-authored 3 books on Canadian economic history, a history of the Canadian dollar, a history on the governorship of James Coyne. Don't you find it interesting that a governor of the Bank of Canada had the last name Coyne? C-O-Y-N-E in this case. And also, this one I've got to find from you, James. You're going to have to send me a copy of this. A history of counterfeiting in Canada. James is no stranger to online presentations, as I mentioned earlier. Since the pandemic, James, on behalf of the HSO, has been reaching out to the community by doing Zoom presentations on a number of Ottawa-related topics for the HSO. And speaking of Ottawa-related topics, James also works on his blog site called Today in Ottawa's History, which you can visit at todayinottawahistory.wordpress.com. Or as I've done, just type in Today in Ottawa History into Google and you'll find it easily that way. Where you'll find all sorts of interesting topics about Ottawa, ranging from the Dutch royal family to the Rolling Stones and everything in between. So tonight, James is going to tell us the story of one of Canada's great tragic heroes, Thomas D'Arcy McGee. So would you please welcome our speaker for tonight, James Powell.
Thanks, Richard. I really appreciate it. And thanks, everybody, for joining us and listening to me. It's a lovely evening out, so I understand. I appreciate you listening to me rather than enjoying the nice, one of the first nice spring evenings. I'm going to talk about the assassination of D'Arcy McGee tonight. What I'm going to do is break it up into parts. Firstly, who was Thomas D'Arcy McGee? So I say a little bit about his background. I'll talk about the actual assassination, who did it, and particularly I'll say a lot about the Fenians, try to provide a sense of the times and why they were fingered as the likely suspects. Who was Patrick James Wayland, the man who was arrested, tried, and was found guilty and executed for the crime. I'll talk about the trial, his execution, and the subsequent doubts about the verdict. And finally, just say a few words about McGee's legacy, because it's still with us today. Okay, firstly, who was Thomas D'Arcy McGee? There's a picture of him as a very young man. He was born April 13th, 1825 in Carlingford, Ireland. Carlingford is due south of Belfast. Today it's right on the border, really, of the Republic and Northern Ireland. As a very young teenager, he was a proficient speaker at temperance rallies, believe it or not. He was, with his friend Sir John A. later on, a prodigious drinker, is my understanding. So it was kind of a little bit ironic that he won his spurs, as you might say, as an orator speaking at temperance meetings. He immigrated to Boston in 1842. He was just a teenager at the time, and started working as a journalist and author at a newspaper called The American Celt. At this time, he advocated that the United States should take over Canada. But while he was in Boston, his writing attracted the attention of people back in the old country in Ireland, and he was asked to come back to Ireland to write there. While he was there, he married Mary Caffrey, and with whom they had 5 children. He was politically active. His first job as a journalist in Ireland was with the Freeman's Journal. Now, the Freeman's Journal was a nationalist newspaper associated with a man called Daniel O'Connell. Daniel O'Connell's Repeal Association. Daniel O'Connell was an MP, an Irish MP sitting in Westminster. He formed this association to repeal the 1800 Act of Union. The Act of Union was the act which brought all of Ireland in with England and Scotland into one government in Westminster. Prior to 1800, Ireland had its own parliament. Following the Act of Union, the Irish Parliament was no more, and Irish residents elected MPs to the Parliament in Westminster. O'Connell was active in fighting this to repeal this act. He was also fought for what was called Catholic emancipation in 1822. Prior to 1829. Prior to 1829, Catholics in the United Kingdom had their rights restricted on what they could and could not do, and finally it was that those restrictions were removed in 1829. McGee later joined another newspaper called The Nation. This was more radical than Freeman's Journal. It supported Irish independence by force if necessary, and it was tightly associated with what was called the Young Ireland movement. Now, 1848 was a critical year in European history. There were revolutions right across Europe, continental Europe. For example, France turfed out the King Louis Philippe. There's revolutions in Denmark. There was uprisings throughout Germany, Sicily, and the Austrian Empire. Most of these revolutions failed. They were had some initial success, but then the counter revolutionary forces took over. But in 1848, the Young Ireland movement saw these revolutions as an incentive for revolution in Ireland. And the leaders of the movement, including a man called William O'Brien, went to Paris, who was now a Republican government, at least temporarily, for support, financial, military. But what they got instead was the tricolor flag, which you'll see the Irish flag, the green, white, and orange flag. But they got little else. And actually, this flag was raised for the first time in 1848 at a place called Ballygarry in South Tipperary, where the revolution, as you might, which is too strong a word, fizzled. There was a shootout with 50 Ulster Constabulary members. The Young Irish leaders were arrested, tried for treason, and William O'Brien was actually sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. This is 1848, but he was spared that gruesome event and was transported to Australia with the other young Irish movement leaders. He did get back to the United Kingdom, but he was no longer a force in politics from that point on. The Rising failed. The Young Irish movement people overestimated support of the population, and in particular, the clergy in Ireland was opposed. Now, McGee was involved in this rising. He had gone to Scotland to raise men in arms among the Irish living there. His aim was to seize a ship and return to Ireland to support the insurrection that was supposed to be taking place. But when everything fizzled and the leaders were arrested, McGee fled back to the United States, where he resumed his career as a journalist. But he became increasingly disillusioned with the U.S. owing to discrimination. At this time, there was a rising movement called the Know Nothing Party. The Know Nothing Party was also it started off as a secret society, and it was called the Know Nothing Party because when people were asked, what do you stand for? Who are you? They say, well, I know nothing about this. So they became known as the Know Nothing Party. Later became the Native American Party, not to be confused with Indigenous Americans. but then just the American Party. And there's a flag on the left there of the slide. While this group had some positive elements, they were reformist in terms of for workers' rights and women's rights. They were a bit wishy-washy on slavery at the time, but what they were was xenophobic, highly anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant, and particularly anti-Irish. Like what we have today with conspiracy theories, they believed in a conspiracy theory then that the Pope was going to try to take over the United States through its bishops and priests, the Roman Catholic bishops and priests, and directing the Roman Catholic churchgoers how to vote. So that was why they were anti-Irish. And so McGee found this to be quite oppressive, what was going on, and looked north. He was actually invited to Montreal in 1857, where he starts a newspaper called The New Era. And notwithstanding the strength of the Orange Order, particularly in what was to become Ontario, this is still a province of Canada, so this would be Canada West. He found that Irish settlers were prospering. In Canada East, at least, their rights were protected as Catholics. And they were doing much better than their confreres, immigrants to the United States. And so what we all of a sudden we see this ardent Irish nationalist becoming a Canadian nationalist and a major supporter of Confederation of the British North American colonies. In December of 1857, he wins a seat in Montreal, the general election for the province of Canada. He sat initially as an independent, and then the following year, one of his first Canadian books come out. You see it there, Canadian Ballads of an Occasional Verses. In 1862, he's invited to become a cabinet minister in the reform government of Sandfield Macdonald, not to be confused with John A. And the next year, he trosses the floor to Conservative Party. He had become a good friend of John A. Macdonald. The following year, he becomes a Minister of Agriculture and Immigration in the very short-lived government of John A. Macdonald and Sir Etienne Taché. There on the left is a picture of the Charlottetown Conference in 1864. He was a key player at that conference and the following Quebec Conference, which led to Confederation. And if you look closely in that picture, you'll see McGee standing in front of the second column in the back. You can see that hair, big hair sticking out. And at the Quebec Conference, he was the one who presents the motion on protecting the educational rights of both Catholics and Protestants in the new Dominion of Canada. And he was the most eloquent advocate of Confederation of all the fathers of the Confederation. On April 6, 1868, this is just before the assassination, there was in the House of Commons a very lengthy debate over Confederation. Nova Scotia was having second thoughts about Confederation. There was petitions, and a Nova Scotia MP, Dr. I can't think of his name now, Tupper, was sent over to England to represent the Dominion, and there was complaints about that. And in this debate, D'Arcy McGee said, and I'll say these words out because they're quite fascinating. I, sir, who have been and who am still, that's Confederation's warm and earnest advocate, speak here not as the representative of any race or of any province, but as thoroughly and emphatically a Canadian, ready and bound to recognize the claims, if any, of my Canadian fellow subjects from the farthest east to the farthest west, equally as those of my nearest neighbor or of the friend who proposed me on the hustings. So that really sums up his affection and strength of will about Confederation. Sadly, within just minutes, if not maybe an hour or so after saying those words, he was dead. the House adjourned at 2:05 a.m. on the 7th of April, 1868. McGee bought 3 cigars, got his cane and coat and gloves, had a few words to Sir John A., and walked out of the center block with another MP, Robert McFarland, down the center path from the center block, down the center path of Parliament Hill, crossed Wellington Street, and to Spark Street. Now they walked arm in arm. McGee had an ulcerated leg. He didn't walk very well. It was a cold night as well. There was some snow. At Spark Street, McFarland and McGee parted company. McFarland headed east to Safford's Bridge. That was the only bridge across the Rideau Canal, while McGee headed west to his lodgings. McFarland bid McGee good night. McGee said to McFarland, "God bless you." Those were his last words. At his lodgings at Mrs. Trotter's boarding house, which was in what was also called the Toronto House in the Deborah building. That's a picture of, on the left there, which is at the corner of Sparks and O'Connor Streets. Now that's the location of Nate's Restaurant. Now the Deborah building was a brand new building. It was only 3 years old at the time. It was owned by I think it's Georges Edouard Debarret, who was the Queen's printer for Ottawa. Anyway, he bent as McGee, it was of course a dark night, hard to see. He bent down to insert his key into the front door. A shot rang out, and McGee was felled by a bullet to the back of the neck at close range. Inside, there was Mrs. Trotter, his landlady. She had been waiting up for her son, who was a page in the House of Commons. So he had to work late. And so she quickly opened the door and found McGee in a pool of blood on her doorstep. There was no sign of the assassin. A Dr. Donald McGilvery was called, who arrived a few minutes later at 2:30 to find blood running across the wooden sidewalk from the neck and mouth of McGee's mouth. He was spread-eagled on top of his cane. The doctor picked up the cane. Unfortunately, well, McGee's teeth had been knocked out in the fire shooting, and pried out the bullet that was close to the keyhole in Mrs. Trotter's front door. It was a post-mortem. What happened next was McGilvery directed a constable to call the coroner, a Dr. Van Cortlandt. Dr. Van Cortlandt was perhaps the force in the medical community here in Ottawa at the time. He came at 3 o'clock. He immediately secured the site from passers-by and called a jury the next morning to view the body at 10 a.m. McGilvery performed the post-mortem, assisted by another doctor, Dr. Wolfe, in the presence of the coroner, Van Cortlandt, as well as many others, actually. There was a cast of thousands, it seems, who reviewed this post-mortem. McGilvery gave Van Cortlandt the bullet that slayed McGee, who in turn gave it to the police. Now, if you go back and read the Ottawa Citizen of the time, they didn't hold back on the details of the autopsy. It was all there in black and white. The weight of McGee's brain, it was larger than average, 3 pounds, 11 ounces. The state of his liver, slightly enlarged. Other organs, kidneys, intestines, all healthy. So they really didn't shy away from the gory details. On the left is a representation of the bullet, what it looked like, figure number 1, misshapen after striking McGee's neck and going through going into the door of the rooming house. The inquest was held the next day at 7 p.m. First meeting in the Toronto House where McGee lived, and later in offices at the House of Commons. McGee's body was then brought to Notre Dame Basilica, then to the train station, MacDonald and Cartier were among the pallbearers. He was laid in state in Montreal in their family home on St. Catherine Street. And the funeral was on the Easter Monday, April 13th, at St. Patrick's Cathedral. It was a day of mourning. There was the whole city closed down. As you can see, the funeral cortege was immense. There were 15,000 people in the cortege. There you can see his funeral carriage in the middle there. Most of Montreal came out to witness the event, to bid him adieu. He was buried in Notre-Dame-des-Neiges Cemetery, and here's what his cemetery looks like today, or his tomb site, the vault. Okay, who shot him? Well, there was a large reward was posted for information leading to the arrest of the assassin, posted by the city of Ottawa. There's on the left is the proclamation announcement given under order by Henry J. Friel, mayor of Ottawa, $2,000. The police arrested the usual suspects. And anybody who looked suspicious, they arrested, including one man who was picked up at a bar for saying, "Oh, McGee got his just desserts," and so they arrested him on the spot. But suspicion quickly fell on the Fenians and one man in particular, Patrick James Wayland. Now, why? Well, the Fenians considered McGee to be a traitor to the Irish cause because he was once an Irish nationalist, and now he was a minister of the crown. For his part, McGee had described the Fenians as irreligious, foolish, and dangerous. The Fenians at this time were actually a real threat to Canada. Now, who were the Fenians? I digress a little bit here to just talk a little bit about the Fenians and why, and to give a sense of the environment in which the assassination occurred and people's sentiments. As you're aware, millions of Irish immigrants came to North America in the 19th century, fleeing the potato famine, British misrule and neglect. McGee, of course, in the 40s came over just roughly by the time of the potato famine, the start of the potato famine. The main port of entry here in Canada was at Gros Isle at Quebec City. There was about 5,000 would-be Irish immigrants are buried at Gros Isle. It is now a National Historic Site, and the number of Irish that came to Canada, was in the numbers of upwards of 500,000. Now, a couple million, of course, millions went to the United States, but 500,000 in Canada, in small population of Canada, was huge. And extraordinarily, by the 1880s, not long after this, a quarter of Canadian residents were Irish or of Irish descent. 20% of Quebec City were Irish. We think today of Quebec City as a pretty francophone city, but back in the day, in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, there was a very large Anglophone community there. Now, of course, most of these Irish immigrants to Canada didn't have a whole lot of warm feelings towards the British, and some, like the Fenians, wanted an independent Ireland and willing to fight for it. So they were sort of like the proto-IRA today. And Fenian chapters spread across the United States, largely in the United States, but also in Canada. And after 1865, the Fenians saw their chance. Now, what was critical about 1865 was that was the end of the US Civil War. And in the Union Army particularly, there were tens of thousands of Irish-born or Irish descended soldiers. They were veterans. They were highly armed, highly trained, and very capable soldiers. They just fought and won a very bloody civil war. And so when they were demobilized, many of the Fenians, brotherhoods, thought that many of these Irish soldiers, ex-soldiers or ex-veterans, would turn their attention to the idea of freeing Ireland from the British. And in 1865, the Fenian Brotherhood actually sent a ship over to Ireland to try to, filled with arms, to start a revolt in Ireland. The Royal Navy quickly put a stop to that. So with them unable to do things directly, the goal of the Fenians, particularly in the United States, was to conquer Canada and to force Britain to free Ireland. Now, this might sound a little quixotic, a little odd rationale, but the idea was that if they moved quick enough and invaded, if they, from the United bases in the United States, they moved quick enough and invaded Canada, they could get perhaps the US and other countries to recognize their seizure of Canada, and they could negotiate with the British that they would give back Canada if the British would free Ireland. It sounds pretty quixotic, sounds pretty weird, but that was their aim. And actually the slogan of the 1865 Fenian Congress in Cincinnati was "On to Canada." As I mentioned, there's a lot of Union Army support. Many of the members, senior members of the Fenian Brotherhood and in the Fenian Army were former Union Army officers. The Secretary, the Fenian Secretary of War, was a man called Sweeney, who had been a general, I believe, of the US Army. Okay, in 1866, 2 years before the assassination of D'Arcy McGee, Fenian Army, led by General John O'Neill, was organized up in upstate New York, threatening to invade Canada. And Prime Minister MacDonald called out for 10,000 volunteers to be mobilized to protect Canada. Here in Ottawa, we had the Civil Service Rifle Corps was mobilized. There's a picture on the left there of a couple of the members. Now, the Civil Service Rifle Corps was founded in Quebec City in 1861, following what was called the Trent Affair. The Trent Affair was at the early days of the US Civil War. A US naval ship had stopped a British ship, the Trent, who was carrying two Confederate diplomats to London. The Trent was going from Cuba to London. The US Navy captain took these two men off the ship, and this was in breach of international law and the neutrality and British neutrality. And so it came very close to war at the time between Britain and the United States. And President Lincoln said they didn't want to fight two wars with the British and the Confederacy. So they quickly gave back the two diplomats to the British. There was another thing that soured, other factors that soured U.S. Towards Britain. One was the British, in British shipyard, the Confederate raider of the Alabama was built, the sort of skating around the neutrality laws. And also there were gun running ships moving out of places like Bermuda and the Bahamas, running guns to the Confederacy in exchange for cotton for the mills in England. So there was a lot of ill feeling between the Union government, in the Union government and Union and U.S. population towards Britain. And that was really why the Fenians thought that they could perhaps get away with it, of invading Canada if they moved quickly enough. So in March 1866, rumor was that the Fenians were going to attack on St. Patrick's Day. The Civil Service Rifle Corps was called out to protect Ottawa. It was a bit of a glamping, though, at least in the first night of guard duty here in the city. One of the members of the regiment of the Corps was a Rideau Club member, and he ordered in dinner of beef sirloin and plum pudding, which was served by Rideau Club waiters for the Corps. But after a couple of weeks, things settled down and people were demobilized. But this was followed by a Fenian raid on Campobello Island in New Brunswick. Nothing much happened. I remember New Brunswick was not part of Canada at this time. There's a couple of houses were destroyed, but it was repulsed by the Royal Navy. But the Corps was called out again. in May 1866, and this was more serious. Other units in the neighborhood were mobilized. I have a list there: the Bell's Corner Company, the Argenteuil Rangers, various companies of the Ottawa Rifles. These were formed the Ottawa Provisional Battalion. Later, the 43rd Battalion of Infantry was formed from units from Bell's Corners, Huntley, Metcalfe, North Gore, Munster, Richmond, Manotick, Vernon, and Duncanville. And the battalion, Ottawa Provisional Battalion, was called out again in June. They're put on a train, ready to go to defend Prescott from Fenian and potential Fenian raiders in Ogdensburg. Fortunately, it didn't happen, but there were other battles, as you may undoubtedly are aware. June 2nd, 1866, the Battle of Ridgeway near Niagara. This was General O'Neill, followed by the Battle of Fort Erie. 1,000 veteran Fenian soldiers met with boys and apprentices and students, farmers, Canadians, put the Canadians to flight, at least temporarily. But once when 5,000 Canadian militia backed up with some British troops, units arrived on the scene, they quickly retreated. About a week later, there was in the Eastern Townships another skirmish at the Battle of Pigeon Hill. Oddly, an Irishman called named Timothy O'Hara wins the Victoria Cross, but this is a Fenian disaster. There were 32 Canadian militia soldiers killed, 103 wounded in the 66 raids. There was one British soldier who was identified just a few years ago as having died in these raids. And so in a way, the Fenians were another father of Confederation because they really scared the British colonies in North America that what could happen, and that in unity there was strength. Just coincidentally, in 1867, Alexander Muir, who wrote the Maple Leaf Forever in honor of Confederation, he was at the Battle of Ridgeway, and he's one of the amongst the picture there, but I don't know which one he is. Okay, just to finish things off, to complete, there were other raids, Fenian raids, subsequently in 1870 and 71. Fenians were repulsed at the Battle of Ecclesfield near Missisquoi in the Eastern Townships, again at Trout River. And there was a last gasp with General O'Neill attempted to invade Manitoba the following year, and that was, he took on a trading station in Pembina, and it was the U.S. Army actually just picked up these few men that were there. So that sort of sets the stage of why the environment, people looked at with great suspicion at the Fenians. Okay, the investigation of the assassination. The man in charge was another Irishman, Edward O'Neill. He was the chief investigator. He had been tipped off to look for Wayland, who was arrested at 9:30 on the same night that McGee was assassinated in Starr's Tavern on Clarence Street, where he was boarding. In fact, when the inquest was held, Wayland was the prime suspect. In his pocket, police found a number of incriminating things: a box of cartridges, an Irish-American newspaper, which is a bit of a nationalist newspaper, a badge of the Toronto Iberian Benevolent Fund, not fun, a missing letter there, membership card to the St. Patrick's Benevolent Fund, and most ominously, a recently fired Smith & Wesson revolver. Seems that one chamber was newly greased with a new bullet, the other bullets were old, and the mouth of the barrel showed some signs of a fresh discharge of powder. On the left, there is a picture of Wayland's revolver. It was purchased by the Canadian Museum of History in 2005 for $105,000. Okay, there's a picture of Patrick James Wayland. I think it's perhaps the only picture of the man. He was born in 1840 in Galloway, Ireland, which is on the west coast of Ireland, right across, sort of due west of Dublin. He came to Canada, Quebec City in 1865 as a tailor. He was actually in the Quebec Volunteer cavalry as a sergeant, and he had been temporarily arrested but released on vague charges of being associated with Fenians or being involved with some Fenian acts, but it was not very clear. It was believed that he had gone to the States, Buffalo, which was a Fenian hotbed for a while, and then it was in Hamilton, Ontario, before showing up in Montreal, where he marries a woman called Bridget Boyle, who was 30 years his senior, and where he was associated with alleged Fenian groups, one being the St. Patrick's Society. In the fall of 1867, he comes alone to Ottawa, where he again is associated with various Irish nationalist groups, but he's working as a tailor for a company called P&P Eagleson. And on March 17th, 1868, just a couple of weeks before the McGee's death, he was assistant marshal in the Ottawa St. Patrick's Day Parade. The trial was a sensation. It was flawed by decay standards, as I'll talk about shortly. It lasted 6 days. It really had the best lawyers of the age duking it out, and kind of oddly, given their backgrounds, the two lawyers were on the opposite sides that you would think you'd think. The Crown prosecutor was another Irishman, James O'Reilly, Queen's Counsel from Kingston, Irish Catholic, who excluded all Roman Catholics from the jury for potential bias. Defense counsel was a man called John Hilliard Cameron, a staunch Church of England goer, Grand Master of the Orange Order, so therefore somebody who's very against the Fenians and anything Irish Catholics, conservative politician, but his hefty fees, because he didn't come cheap, he was a very high-powered attorney, were paid by Irish Catholics in Canada who feared, quite understandably, hasty justice for Wayland. The evidence, okay. Firstly, there's a picture of Wayland's lawyer, John Hilliard Cameron, on the left. The Crown demonstrated that the revolver had been recently fired, but the defense, Cameron, showed that it had actually been accidentally fired by a hotel maid a week before McGee's murder. She actually, I guess she was cleaning his room and shot herself in the arm somehow. A man had come forward, Jean-Baptiste Lacroix, claiming to have seen Wayland tailing McGee and shooting him, but the defense really rubbished his claims. Lacroix only showed up quite a length of time after the assassination, after the $2,000 reward had been published, and his testimony was a bit shaky. He couldn't really come up with some clear facts. He thought Wayland was smaller was a small man, smaller than McGee, and it turns out that Wayland was quite a bit larger. He's a large man. He couldn't identify what color hat McGee was wearing. So there's things that made people very suspicious about his testimony. And Cameron's closing address to the jury was an incredible legal tour de force. It lasted for 2 hours and 40 minutes. It makes for quite tedious reading. But the Crown brought other witnesses who testified that Wayland had been stalking McGee, both in Montreal and in Ottawa. In the previous New Year's, there had been, in Montreal, McGee was home with his half-brother, and there had been a knock on the door, and McGee's half-brother went to the door, opened it, and there was Wayland, who sort of stammered out some excuse about why he was there, saying that, oh, I heard there's going to be an attack on his house, then took off. And nothing happened, but it was, the McGee's just shrugged it off. But later on, other witnesses saw McGee in Mrs. Trotter's boarding house and in the House of Commons watching McGee speak, and he was even watching McGee speak the night prior to his murder. A number of witnesses also heard Wayland calling McGee a traitor and uttering threats. And perhaps less problematic was Detective Andrew Cullen testified that he overheard Whalen in jail saying to another prisoner, "I shot that fellow like a dog. My name will go down to posterity." And another witness said he overheard Whalen saying that there were two others involved in the assassination, but they had skedaddled before the murder. Now, Whalen said he was innocent and denied being a Fenian. Notwithstanding this largely circumstantial evidence, Whalen was found guilty and was sentenced to hang. Now, the process. On the left is a picture of the judge who presided over the trial, Judge William Richards, later Sir William Richards. He was become the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada when it was formed. The trial, at least by today's standards, was very flawed, but not necessarily at the standards of 1868. And certainly after the trial, I'm not aware of any complaints of people saying that there was faulty justice. Among the things that went wrong was Sir John A., while he was Prime Minister, he had also had a secondary role as Attorney General. Well, in his role as Attorney General, he sat beside his friend, Judge Richards, through the trial, something which is clearly not beyond the pale. But even less forgivable than that was then when Whalen's lawyer appealed the guilty verdict. Richards, who by this point had been raised to the Court of Appeals, sat on his own decision that so he did not recluse himself from voting on the appeal. And when the verdict was appealed again, he still voted. So he was voting on his own conduct in the original trial, which is clearly inappropriate by any standards, then or now. Okay, the execution. On the 11th of February, 1869, Whalen met his end. He never admitted guilt. The night before his execution, his wife went and saw him. He told her apparently that he didn't do it, but it was better to hang than to be an informer. He said also that he knew who shot McGee because he had been there. He was hanged at the Carleton County Jail. There's a vintage photograph of it. Here's the site of the gallows. At 5 a.m., he was aroused from sleep and celebrated Mass in the prison chapel. He had breakfast, and at 11 a.m., Sheriff Whalen and 3 priests appeared on the balcony. There were more than 8,000 people watching the hanging in a driving snowstorm. Even newspapers covering the event were appalled that so many women and children were there watching this event. After repeating a Paternoster, Whalen spoke a few final words. He begged pardon for any offenses he had given and forgave all parties. And his last words were, "God save Ireland and God save my soul." Did he do it? Well, we'll never know for sure. Ballistics tests on the revolver were conducted in 1973, but were inconclusive. Of course, back in the 1860s, this was 50 years, if not 60 years before ballistics tests were even thought of. But even if they could match the bullet to the revolver, you really couldn't prove who pulled the trigger. By his own words, though, he was at least an accomplice. But as I mentioned today, by today's standards, there were many procedural flaws to the trial. It's a subject, the whole trial of Whalen's guilt or innocence is a subject of a modern day one-man play by Ottawa's own Pierre Brault called Blood on the Moon. That's him on the left. The play was premiered in 1999 in actually the old jail on Nicholas Street. Occasionally, Pierre Brault does reprise this here in Ottawa. I saw this performance just a few years ago. I'd encourage anybody to see anything by Pierre Brault. He did something recently on in the Diefenbunker on the Cold War in Canada, and he has a number of one-man plays that he puts on. They're all brilliant. So I'll give a plug to Pierre Brault here, particularly for his performance in Blood on the Moon. Okay, finally, just a few words on the legacy of D'Arcy McGee. He was the author of more than 20 books, many on various Irish history, Irish literature. Of course, his book on Canadian verse. One of the fathers of Confederation. But I think most importantly is that he was really the first Canadian to see himself as an unhyphenated Canadian. Up until that time, there were French Canadians, English Canadians, Scots, Irish. He was the one who said, no, I'm a Canadian. A statue on the left is up on Parliament Hill, behind the Parliament building, Centre Block. It was commissioned in 1910 by and built or made, cast by G.W. Hill. It was delayed by World War I. It was in Belgium, apparently. It was buried during the war. And after the war, it was erected without ceremony in 1922 behind the Centre Block. So I'll leave it there. I'll happy to take any questions if I can.
Yeah, thanks, James. We do have some questions for you. I'll start with this one because although you can answer this one, James, I'm going to put this one out to anyone that's in the chat that might have been born or raised in Ireland or have lived there, because they might be able to help answer this question. It says here, Canadian students learn about McGee early on, but how well known is McGee in Ireland? James, you know anything about that?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, as I would say, yeah, with that one, yeah, we'll put that one up in the chat. Anyone who's listening in from Ireland, maybe they can tell us if they heard much about him when they were in school in Ireland. A few more questions here. Which church did McGee attend? I presume it means in Ottawa.
In Ottawa, I think it's the Basilica.
Oh, okay. Was McGee sentenced in 1848 commuted by Queen Victoria?
Is McGee? No, he wasn't. McGee was not acquitted. No.
Yeah. So yeah.
Sorry. McGee was. But
1848.
In 48, I don't know. I don't think he was ever tried or charged with anything actually.
Okay.
By the British.
Because it was kind of.
He certainly left. He certainly didn't. He would have been rounded up. I think time had passed sufficiently that it wasn't an issue.
Yeah, and also an addition to that question was, would the Queen have even known McGee by name at the time?
Yeah, not that I'm aware of, no.
What happened to Mary and the children after McGee's death?
Good question. I really don't know. They certainly, the family lived on. There's actually a D'Arcy McGee at the 60th anniversary of Confederation. And of course, there was a famous grandnephew, one-eyed, it's McGee, the senator, the hockey player. I forgot his name now. It's hit my mind.
Frank One-Eyed McGee.
Frank McGee. He was he played the championship Ottawa Senators team. He was also a Ottawa Rough Rider player. But Frank McGee was he's in the NHL record books for scoring 14 goals in one game of a Stanley Cup against the Senators played against the Dawson City Nuggets in 1905. Frank McGee died. He cheated on his a sight exam to go into the army during the First War and died at the Battle of the Somme, I believe. So the McGees were certainly active in Ottawa social life for many years to come afterwards.
Now here's an interesting one. As a grade 8 teacher of Canadian history, I am hoping to create a unit that allows students to examine some of the evidence, preferably some primary sources, to determine whether they think Whalen was guilty or not. My first question is, can you recommend a good source of information where I can find some easily accessible primary resources, documents about Whalen?
What you could, online you can find the actual trial verbatim report of the trial. That gives you a lot of information right there. I don't know if the actual artifacts are still around. Certainly there's a picture that I showed you of the bullet. And online in the Ottawa Citizen, you can find reports of the press reports of the assassination. So it's quite actually accessible. Those things are accessible online. Other places to go, perhaps the National Library and Archives Canada can help out there as well. But first place to look is to look online.
Yeah, that would actually be interesting to see how a modern jury of students what kind of ruling they would give, because you have to remember back in these days, the technology for finding evidence isn't quite as strong as what we have nowadays. So sometimes we're unfair in convicting people, being unfair in their decisions, when a lot of it was just a lack of technology that we have nowadays.
Well, yes, there was no technology, there's no forensics really to speak of. And we all know today that jailhouse confession type things are a bit suspect, to say the least. So the testimony of people overhearing what Wayland may or may not have said in jail to somebody else is questionable.
A few more questions here. You've got a lot of them now. I think we'll go with one with Francois, who did not have a question, but he wanted to say D'Arcy McGee's half-brother, the father of Frank, was the longest-serving clerk of the Privy Council for 25 years.
Sorry, I can't hear. You're fading.
Oh, sorry. Let me get a little bit close to my mic here. This is from Francois Brady, who just mentioned that D'Arcy McGee's half-brother was the longest-serving clerk of the Privy Council for 25 years. So I thought I'd mention that. A couple more questions here. Has there been any interest in locating Wayland's body, which I believe is buried in the old jail grounds?
Oh, that's my understanding. I haven't heard of anything like that, no.
And here's another one I hadn't heard of.
Tricky to find him and tricky to identify him.
Well, someone was mentioning here, James, it says, James has said that he was to be hanged, drawn, and quartered.
Oh, that was William O'Brien. William O'Brien, that was in 1848. He was the young Irish movement leader. He was actually, that was the sentence, even in 1848, as recent as that, but it was commuted to transportation to Australia.
Another one here, thanks also, James. Also this year, my students had a lot of questions about the hotel maid shooting herself in the arm. How much credit do you give to that story? Did she make the story up? Is it realistic?
It doesn't seem very realistic. You would think that if somebody shot themselves in the arm that they would seek medical treatment, but maybe because you had to, it couldn't have been a very serious wound if it ever happened. What can you say? I can't say very much. It's the passage of time and what this is the story.
And we got one last.
Even if it had been fired before, it doesn't necessarily mean that the gun hadn't been used to kill McGee. One bullet had been used. It could have been that same, a new bullet still put in that one spot.
Yeah, someone's saying here the doctor retreated or gave testimony at the trial, as did she. And that this was used by the author.
I'm trying to think about what her testimony. I can't remember. Certainly the doctors, the number of doctors testified at the trial.
Yeah, and someone's mentioning now that a lot of the testimony is in one of Pierre Brill's plays as well.
Now the play is excellent. I won't say who Pierre says if he's guilty or not.
And one last question here. Can you say something about McGee's campaign for the execution of American Fenian soldiers held in Canadian prisons? Also, can you, start with that one, yeah.
No, I can't. I used to know more about that.
And something, same question here. Also, can you talk about how the Canadian government's opposition to Fenianism contributed to the creation of CSIS, essentially, the Canadian Domestic
Of which, sorry? Creation of what?
CSIS?
I don't think it did. It had anything to do with CSIS, no. CSIS is a relatively new creation.
Okay, well, that's all the questions, but we had a lot of questions tonight, James. That's in absence of applause at the end of a presentation, which I'm sure you're used to, having done a lot of these. Just the sheer volume of questions we had tonight show that people obviously had a great interest in this topic. You're getting some response now. Thank you very much. So I'll say that.
My pleasure.
On behalf of everyone here, and certainly on behalf of HSO, you've been such a useful member to our organization for a long time, and I want to thank you for an interesting presentation tonight, well researched, and hopefully we'll hear more from you again in the future.
Delighted to. Thanks everybody for listening in and attending this meeting.
Yeah, on such a beautiful night.
Yeah.
Hopefully,
Thank you so much, James.
Speaking of meetings, we've got 2 announcements that I want to make.